To see Mark Schiffman's attack on me in all its gory detail, you go to what, the November issue, right, of 2015 of First Things, the conservative Christian magazine. I should point out, Mark, that in the audience is one of your opponents, Alcibiades, here in the front row, who's responded to you. So I come armed. But, but in any case, let me start by thanking Mark and Georg Steiner and all the rest of you. This is my second time here at Villanova, and it's a great place. As I can testify from this morning's discussion, very lively and as Mark says, very open discussions about the implications of transhumanism for Christianity. And frankly, I don't know another place that can discuss these matters so openly in so many different dimensions. So we even covered the topic of love, for example. Love and transhumanism. Some of you in the audience may wish to ask a question about this when I'm finished. But certainly I cannot recommend another place, certainly in the Christian context, where these issues can be discussed so thoroughly and so fairly, I think. So let me start by saying something about transhumanism and why there even is such a movement. Because this might, again, I don't know where people are entering into this discussion, but it's a discussion that I would say, generally speaking, is kind of in its early stages. And so for those of younger members of the audience who haven't really heard much about transhumanism, you're not too late. There's not that much you need to catch up on, in a sense. But I think the thing that's at stake, when you think about transhumanism, is you also need to think that there's another kind of view on the table as well, and it's called posthumanism. And of course, there's humanism. Now, the reason why I put all these words on the table is because they need to be seen in relation to each other. They all have something to do with the centrality of human beings, at least as a source of value in the world, at least historically. Now, that's certainly what humanism has been. And if you look historically as to where the value of humanity has come from, historically, it's come from theology, and it's come from the privileged position of human beings in the world. And I think this is certainly true of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That is one thing I think they all share in common, is the centrality of the human as a creature. But then there's an issue about where does that centrality come from? Okay? Now, the reason why these religions are called Abrahamic is, of course, because God spoke to Abraham, and Abraham is the source of these religions, so there's a sort of communicative sense in which there is some kind of privileging going on. But within Christianity, there has been this very strong idea that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, that sort of phrasing from Genesis has had a very strong significance, and a very strong significance with regard to empowering people to think that they can understand and maybe even potentially control all that there is, because we are created in the image and likeness of God. And this is called the Imago Dei doctrine, and in Christianity, not necessarily with this very strong interpretation that I'm giving it, but nevertheless St. Augustine is someone who is identified with having drawn attention to this doctrine as quite central to Christianity's distinctiveness. And I think, as an Abrahamic religion different from Islam, whereas in Islam the human being is generally seen as kind of a vessel for God to deposit himself in, and this is certainly how Muhammad is portrayed. In Christianity, right, we actually have the figure of Jesus, who is the God incarnated as a human being. Okay, and that is a very significant difference, and that is one of the, in terms of the guiding imaginary of this kind of empowering sense of humanism that comes out of Christianity, the figure of Jesus is very important. Now, what transhumanism claims is, in a sense, the human-centeredness that one can already see in Christianity hasn't gone far enough. Okay? Now, in contrast, post-humanism generally thinks that the human-centeredness has gone too far. Okay, so we've got, now, what is the context in which this kind of distinction arises? Well, obviously, human beings have made a big difference to the way in which the world is. And so nowadays, geologists and environmentalists talk about the last 250, 300 years as having been the Anthropocene. That is to say, the period in history where human beings have made the most difference to the character of the earth. And of course, you know, this has been both for good and for ill. We have sort of remade the earth, you might say, in our image and likeness in terms of making virtually every part of the earth habitable by human beings. But also there's been an enormous amount of cost. Cost to the environment, of course, to other species, and of course, cost even to fellow human beings in the process. So the Anthropocene is by no means an unmitigated good. There have been a lot of problems. And people draw different conclusions from this. And you see a lot of this kind of played out in very secular political terms, in terms of the dispute over global warming, the current climate crises that we have been facing for many years now. It's from this that post-humanism starts to get some traction, namely the idea that we have overestimated the value and significance of the human, and that rather what we should be doing is thinking about the human as just one other life form, all life forms of which have value, right? That we need a more egalitarian approach, you might say, to species, right? That we are not the superior one, but that all life forms are entitled to live and nature is entitled to flourish, and there's this kind of perspective. However, transhumanism, which is what I want to mainly focus on, says exactly the opposite. Namely, that we have not gone far enough. Okay? That in a sense, whatever deficiencies, whatever harms that we have caused to ourselves or the world in the time that we have been on this planet is because we have not, as it were, fully realized what we can be. Right? In a sense, we have not really fully realized our godlike potential, essentially. Okay? And this is what makes transhumanism, I think, theologically a very interesting position, but also an extremely controversial position, both in secular and, of course, in religious quarters. In secular quarters, it's controversial because, generally speaking, there is a kind of agreement that human beings have been doing a lot of damage to the environment, to the world. We have increased inequalities. There's a lot of issues where, in a sense, we have been mounting all kinds of harms and, you might say, deficits even with regard to our balance sheet with nature. And transhumanism might be seen as a position that ignores that or doesn't take that sufficiently seriously. And this is what the post-humanists would say. Okay? If you want an example of a post-humanist, if this idea is not so obvious to you, you could think about somebody like Peter Singer, the ethicist who's been a very big defender for over 40 years of animal rights, right? And the degree to which we have exploited animals and other life forms for human benefit. But at a theological level, of course, and this is something that Mark was alluding to in his opening remarks, there is this idea of transhumanism as basically turning the human being into God, right? In a sense that is, in some sense, not sufficiently mindful of our theological origins. And this, I think, is a serious issue. I don't want to deny this. But there is an open question about what that exactly means. In other words, if part of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God is both that we have a godlike potential, but also we have a responsibility that is commensurate with that potential, what does that responsibility entail? How should we carry out that power and that knowledge that we are undoubtedly increasingly gaining and, in a sense, bringing us closer to a godlike state. What does it mean to act morally under those circumstances? And one of the things that transhumanists say, and regardless of whether they're religious or secular, is we cannot avoid this fate. In other words, knowledge and power is our future. There is no turning back. There is no saying no. The question is, what does it mean to act in a responsible manner under these circumstances? Okay? So that's the question, you might say, that the transhumanists put on the table. And so then the issue becomes, well, there's a few issues. First of all, let's take the issue of what exactly is trans about transhumanism. Okay, because so far the way I've been presenting transhumanism, and I think this is more or less accurate, namely that transhumanism believes in the first instance that humanism hasn't gone far enough. In other words, the way in which humanity has raised itself above the animals, so primarily through science and technology, okay, through culture, through things of that kind. It has got us to a certain level, but it has not got us as far as we can go. And so then the question then becomes, how far can we go? What does it mean to go beyond where we are now? And here's where transhumanism, in a way, gets interesting again, both from a secular and theological standpoint. Because transhumanism is not necessarily committed to the idea that we remain as Homo sapiens. And the way, so in other words, we have come to be the way we are, basically as a kind of enhanced upright ape. Okay, we're an enhanced upright ape who lives, let's say, 2, 3, 4 times more than our ancestors did millions of years ago. But nevertheless, we are still pretty much in this body, in this genetic form, where its composition has been primarily determined by, let's call it, evolution. And of course, we have made various enhancements, of course, through medicine, through architecture, through the infrastructure of the world, all these other things. But nevertheless, we have remained in this body pretty much as given. And so there's a question that transhumanism raises about whether our continued humanity requires that we stay in this form. Okay? Now, why might the answer be no? Well, the answer might be no because of our knowledge that we have of how we have come to be as we are. Okay? And here let's think about biology. We are not, let us accept Darwin's theory of evolution as given. Let's just accept that for the sake of argument. Nevertheless, and so we have come to be as we are over billions of years of the development of life. And yet, when we get to the 19th and 20th centuries, we now come to understand how the process works. Whereas all of the creatures before us have merely obeyed evolution, we actually know it, right? And by knowing it, that is to say, by knowing the principles of genetic variation, of natural selection, the way it operates in different environments to different effects, we know about this both in the field and in the laboratory, we actually potentially have greater control over the situation than any of our predecessors have ever had. And this especially became true in the 1950s and afterwards with the molecular biology revolution, right, the discovery of the structure of DNA and all of this kind of stuff, which provided the theoretical basis for contemporary biotechnology, and most recently, the sort of genetic editing technology that a couple of months ago now was discussed at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. So we actually have greater knowledge and power of how the whole process works than any other species has ever had. Now, with that knowledge and power gives us then a kind of responsibility that comes from simply the fact that there is a level of freedom open to us that had never been opened before. In other words, by knowing how the genetic code works, by knowing how to intervene, by knowing how to manipulate, we actually have a lot more options at our disposal. We do not necessarily know the effects of these things, that's for sure, and in that respect we remain very ungodlike. But nevertheless, we have the freedom to intervene. And to intervene at finer grain levels, and experiments are done, and they're done on other species, and we're learning more and more about it. And so what this does is, it potentially opens up the opportunities for human beings within the biological space to move in many different directions. Not simply the directions, in terms of one, a parent, breeding a child or something of that kind, but rather many different interventions resulting in many different sorts of offspring. All of this is being made increasingly possible. And this is part of transhumanism, is actually to welcome this kind of diversity. But there's even more radical possibilities. And that has a lot to do also with how we think about our humanity beyond the biological level. Because throughout the history of humanity, and this is especially true, I would say, in the Christian West, there has always been a kind of ambivalence with regard to the material embodiment of the human, right? Where, in a sense, there is a lot of discussion. This even, carries on into the secular period, into figures like Kant, for example, where there is a sense that the animal nature of humanity actually drags down our potential for being fully human. And that in some sense, we need to find ways of escaping that or transforming that. And of course, people like Kant and others have thought about this in primarily intellectual terms, right? Where in some sense we get into a kind of mind space that enables us to be autonomous and to, in some sense, transcend the various passions, the various kinds of forces of nature that kind of divert us from a moral path. But now we might want to think about this in more technological terms. And it's in this context that one talks about things like mind uploading. The uploading of consciousness, right? The idea that our minds might be seen as some kind of digital coding mechanism that could be transformed from the sort of wetware that we normally inhabit as human beings into a kind of hardware where not only can it be reproduced, but it could be enhanced, right? And develop new experiences of its own. And that this could be where the future of humanity lies. And this kind of idea, which you may think of as a fantasy, is in fact being very actively pursued. And one of the reasons why it's being actively pursued is because it is actually consistent with a certain kind of ambivalence that human beings have always had about the bodies of their birth, about their biology, and about the fact that to fully realize our humanity, we actually need a different vessel, a different vehicle in which to realize it. Okay? And so the fact that we began as biological organisms, right, upright apes, is just merely a fact of history. It is an accident of history. But once that has come about, and once we have realized, that situation, once we have come to have consciousness of our evolution, then we can take control of it. And that might mean that we actually move away from the kind of simian origins into this other, perhaps silicon-based existence. Now, what makes these kinds of scenarios interesting is the fact that all of these people that I've been talking about, whether we're talking about, the genetically enhanced human being, who might be genetically enhanced, let's say, to live hundreds of years in the same biological body because they've been able to reverse the aging process, and the sort of human being who uploads his or her consciousness into a machine and is then able to exist indefinitely in that form, both of these are seen as transhumanist futures. Okay? Typically different people advocate these views, but they're both transhumanists, and people who defend both of these views will argue that in both cases we are actually realizing what the full potential of what a human being can be. Because a human being's full potential is not normally realized in their lifetime, even in the societies in which they normally live. But there is more there that can be brought forth. And it may involve these kind of more radical forms of embodiment. And it seems to me that this is, there are a lot of questions that get opened up about this. And I think these questions are going to become more salient in the future. One question is, could we actually have a society in which these different transhumanist beings coexisted? That's one question, given the resources and the energy supplies and all the other things that are involved. But I think perhaps more importantly for this crowd, could this sort of society still incorporate people who refuse to transhumanize? In other words, could the humanity 1.0 people, as I would call them, the normal Homo sapiens, people like yourselves at the moment, could you survive in an environment where we became open to these transhumanist beings? And you see, as far as I'm concerned, if we're talking about one of the things that I think all of us in this room very much cherish as part of what the modern secular world has provided for us, the idea of a liberal society, this is where the issue arises. Because liberalism, and I don't mean, Bernie Sanders, right? What I mean by liberalism is this idea of being able to tolerate differences in a way where different people can interact, and as a result, you get something productive out of it. Right? These are the sort of thing that we call a modern democratic society has presupposed that level of liberalism. Right? And where you allow everyone the opportunity to act as they wish as long as they don't interfere with the actions of others. That basic notion of liberalism. That notion of liberalism has historically worked because people have been thought of as, roughly speaking, natural equals. And whatever differences there have been between people, and of course there's always been differences in terms of, race, gender, class, whatever, they've sort of canceled each other out or have been seen as complementary. And there's never been this idea that there's been any kind of absolute superior kind of being over others. Right? So that whatever inequalities that there have been, and there have been plenty, they have been seen as inequalities and differences that in some way could be mitigated. Now, admittedly, we live in a world today where inequalities are increasing, at least in terms of wealth. Nevertheless, the kinds of inequalities in terms of natural capacities that we're opening ourselves up to in a world of transhumanism is much greater potentially. And this is something to think about. How would we deal with that? So, for example, would people who we now consider normal humanity 1.0 healthy-bodied people like you in the room, would you suddenly become disabled because you haven't been enhanced? Right? This is an issue that would be very much on the table. It's for this reason, of course, that a lot of people then want to stop all this, right? Prevent any of this from going through, from, putting an enormous amount of checks on our ability, let's say, to engage in any kind of genetic interventions. Even to put constraints on artificial intelligence research out of fear that we might develop forms of superintelligences with or without human input. Right? There's a moves afoot to do that. Here I get to a point that Mark was alluding to in his introduction, and this has to do with what is our attitude toward risk here. Okay? And closely tied to the transhumanist sensibility is a proactionary as opposed to a precautionary attitude toward risk. And so let me explain this, because this is very much about the kind of worldview one has when one thinks about this. On Wednesday evening, back in Britain, I am going to be debating a Green politician over this issue. The Royal Institute of Philosophy in the UK has devoted this year to a discussion of the precautionary principle versus the proactionary principle. And this is about attitudes toward risk, because this is an issue that arises not only with regard to the constitution of the future human condition, but also the world we live in now, where we're talking about medical interventions, environmental interventions, and stuff like that in the current day. And basically, to put it in a nutshell, the proactionary principle treats risk as an opportunity, right? Risk at the, in the first instance, risk is about dealing with uncertainty. And then the question becomes, what do you make of this uncertainty? Okay? You can either treat it as an opportunity, as opening up a space that hadn't existed there before, for you to try something new, to do something different, or, as in the case of the precautionary principle, you can treat it as a threat, as an object of fear, entering into the unknown, understood in that negative sense. And that's what's at stake here, okay? Now, one of the arguments that gets made for the proactionary principle, which is the one that I endorse, and I've written this book that was mentioned earlier on this topic, is that if you want to explain the kinds of things that humans have done in order to make major leaps and bounds over the course of history, they have been proactionary. In other words, we have taken enormous risks without knowing in advance what the consequences would be. And very often people have put their lives at risk and often have died in the process. But nevertheless, a lot was learned, and the people who were able to benefit from this were able to go forward. And here I'm not just talking about scientific experiments, which is of course the case, right? So in other words, what we would regard, the great scientific experiments in the past that have involved both animals and human subjects, by today's standards would not be allowed. They would be seen as reckless endangerment. But they were allowed. And people learned stuff from it, even though people died and animals died and all the rest of it. And you see this, and if you look at something like the Industrial Revolution and the way in which lands were opened up for development that previously had been used by farmers for centuries, and the radical transformations of landscapes that took place over a relatively short period of time, the amount of displacement that took place of both human beings and animals, radically transformed the face of the earth. And yet, we ended up with where we are now. And while, of course, there are all these problems and we're facing a lot of the backlash from this, nevertheless, it has radically transformed the planet in terms of not only our lifestyles, but our life expectancy and the kinds of control and knowledge that we have over nature and the world. But all of this comes at a cost. And the precautionary principle, in contrast, argues that to a large extent, much of this was a mistake, if not most of it. So, for example, even take something one of the things that people often talk about as one of the great achievements of the 20th century is the invention of artificial fertilizer, which enabled enormous numbers of crops to grow in places which otherwise would have mineral depleted fields, and this enabled enormous numbers of people to both grow and to survive and increase the population of the planet. But what has the increase in the population of the planet meant? It has meant actually increasing a larger number of people in poverty. Right? It's not that this increase in the number of people has actually helped the human condition in some unmitigated way. So the argument then gets made, would it not have been better had we not tried to keep so many people alive without thinking about how we would actually deal with them? Would it not be better to live in a more sustainable world with fewer people and lower tech and less science, but in more equilibrium with the environment? The precautionary principle, when taken to its extreme, in a sense, would basically say we made a big mistake, let's say 200, 300 years ago. Okay? And we're paying the cost for it now. This is not an easy issue to adjudicate by any means. And I think it's one that nevertheless is going to be something that, you of the younger generation are increasingly going to have to face. With regard to the extent to which we continue to develop science and technology and allow for transformations of the human condition. But the point I would make here, and maybe I'll close on this, is that, again, this has to do with who we think we are as human beings. However we define ourselves in terms of embodiment, what do we think the human project has been about? Okay? The precautionary principle, and all of these people who decry the use of science and technology to enhance the human condition, basically at the end of the day believe we are just one more animal. Right? And we are an animal who has to live with the other animals. We have different skills, different capacities, but at the end of the day, we are not superior to the other animals. We are just one among many, and we have to learn to live with all the other creatures. Okay? That is, at the end of the day, that is the line, that is the post-humanist line, and that is the line that comes from the precautionary principle. And that the big mistake was for human beings to think that they are superior creatures. But if you do believe that human beings are superior, where does that sense of superiority come from? It doesn't simply come from what we've done, because what we've done has been a mixed bag, as I've just pointed out. Yes, we've done a lot to increase our lot and to increase the number of humans and to leave the human footprint on the planet. We've done a lot of that, but we've also caused a lot of misery, a lot of harm, and we may have even jeopardized our future. At least we have put ourselves in a very dangerous position. What reason do we have to believe that continuing with this policy will succeed? And this is where I think we get into theology. This is where we get into theology in terms of what kind of a being we are as humans. And what has given us the confidence over the last 250, 300 years or more to think that human beings could transform the planet radically, could transform themselves. And here we go back to the image and likeness of God. I think this is where it all comes from. What people call human hubris, okay, is nothing but a kind of fallible application of a very deep theological principle that is at the heart of Christian culture. Okay? And I think it's very important for people who think of themselves as Christians to own this. Okay? To own the fact that we are in the situation we are today because we actually do believe we at least are in the process of understanding how the world works, and that we can take control over the processes of nature, and that is somehow possible for us to do it. We have not done it perfectly, but it is a kind of trajectory that we're on, and that we shouldn't shy away from it. We should own up to the consequences, but nevertheless, it is not something to sort of step back from at this stage in history. How we manage to do that? What does it mean to have moral responsibility in this world of enhanced knowledge and power, in this transhumanist world that we're entering into? That is an open question. How do we adjudicate the various harms that that we're likely to be committing in the future? There's no doubt about it. How do we actually own up to these? How do we repair the damage that's done? And then how do we go forward? How do we learn from our mistakes? But the way we learn from our mistakes is not by trying again. We have to always be trying again. And it seems to me that transhumanism, for all whatever one wants to say about it, is a fundamentally optimistic kind of view. And remember, if you study the history of optimism and you go back to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, optimism is an idea that basically came about because people believed that there was, as it were, a silver lining behind every cloud. Optimism is a view that believes that whatever harms and bads happen in the world are local, and that overall there is something better ahead if we just persevere. This is a view that not only was shared by the Enlightenment, but was also shared by the Christians who came from Britain to the United States. And so when we see places like Providence, right, as names of towns, and those kinds of words from the Protestant dissenting tradition, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a fundamental optimism about the world in the face of whatever harms and costs are borne in the process. And this was how the United States was born, and I think this is an attitude that I think we should have as we go forward in the future collectively as humanity. And I see transhumanism as very much in that spirit. And even though the transhumanists do not tend to own up to their theological roots, I think that's pretty much where the spirit of the enterprise comes from. And it is one that I believe is continuous with the history of Christianity. And I'll stop here and take some questions. Thank you. I'll take the questions, yeah. Yes, sir.
So the deep theological principle at the heart of your talk and what you said is at the heart of Christianity, you might agree that. But another deep theological principle that I think is perhaps more historically verifiable is that of original sin.
Right.
So why the omission, first of all? And second of all, doesn't that Christian theological principle of original sin undermine any theological argument in favor of transhumanism?
No, in fact, original sin is very much part of what I mean. If you listen to what I was saying, and especially when I was talking about optimism at the end, I am constantly stressing harm, right, and error and so forth that's caused along the way. The question is, how do you respond to that, right? That is always the question. There is no denying. I'm not saying the history of humanity has been one unmitigated good where everything just turns out wonderful all the time. On the contrary, there's a lot of misery. But what's the point of the misery? The misery isn't necessarily telling us to stop, it's telling us to learn, right? And to learn means to actually be able to go forward in a more informed state. I mean, I'll give you an example. I don't know if you're familiar, but there's this Australian historian of science and religion by the name of Peter Harrison, who wrote a book about how original sin was very instrumental in the origin of the modern scientific method with Francis Bacon and all those kinds of guys. And the whole point of having the experimental method, if you think about, Bacon's Idols of the Mind, if you ever read any of Francis Bacon's works, right, there is this constant background assumption human beings are very fallible, right? And the biggest, as it were, the biggest acknowledgement of original sin comes from our refusal to recognize and challenge that. Why? By virtue of obeying authority, right? When human beings obey authority because it doesn't cause them any grief, right, they are in fact succumbing to original sin because they're not testing the error of the people who they believe. And this is why it becomes very important to actually have experiments and have these things so that people can show where exactly their ideas and their beliefs are false. And this is what science and technology has been all about. It's been about pushing the limits of humanity. And when things go wrong, we see it very immediately, and it's very big. But it doesn't stop us from trying to overcome that. So it does involve a recognition of original sin. It's just the way you deal with it that matters. Original sin shouldn't, the fact that we have original sin shouldn't be an excuse for not doing anything because you're afraid you're going to do something wrong.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts that will have to be hashed out later, but I think one of them that is worth mentioning now would be, so you mentioned the blind trust of authority being, a reason why a lot of things have gone wrong.
Yes.
Transhumanism to me does not seem to be anything subversive of authority. It seems to be a technocratic authority that is very similar to the other historical mistakes we've made.
No. See, here's the interesting thing, and this is where in a sense, this in a way, in respectable circles, maybe even this circle, undercuts transhumanism's standing. Namely, transhumanists tend to push the boundary of science and technology. Right? In other words, if you're a normal scientist and technologist, you're not a transhumanist. Right? You're someone who is working within an established paradigm. Right? You're not thinking about how to extend people's life expectancies 300 years or something like that. You're thinking in much more modest terms. I mean, transhumanism basically is about extending science and technology beyond its respectable limits. So it is actually challenging authority. And what it gets accused of course, is blurring the line between science and science fiction. That's the way it challenges authority, because in a sense it doesn't respect that boundary very much. Right? Authority is one thing that exists only when there are boundaries for it, and where people respect the boundaries. But as soon as you push away from the boundaries, right, then it's a kind of very open game. And I think transhumanism makes science and technology this very open space, much more open than the scientific establishment would like. Yes?
So what's your take on artificial intelligence? Do you view it like in a proactionary way? So do you think it would help us, or do you think that like having computers be equal to us would be harmful to our future?
My own personal view is I'm open, right? I'm open. And there is a lot of discussion about this business of superintelligences possibly developing to such a point that they won't need humans anymore and they'd get rid of us. I understand that. I actually think that the question there is how humans will affiliate. So in other words, I don't think this superintelligence is going to happen tomorrow. But what is already happening and will be happening for the foreseeable future is that computer-based, artificial intelligences, whatever you want to call them, are becoming more and more integrated with the human life world. And so human beings, in effect, if they're not merging with them exactly, are identifying more with them, and they spend more of their time with them. So if we were to get something like a super intelligent uprising of some sort against human beings, some humans might be on their side.
But the thing is, what I'm wondering is, you asked if we would survive if there were people who were transhumanism,
Yeah, that's
half computer, half person, and then people who were regular humans. Do you think warfare would evolve, though, to the level of transhumanists who would be half human and half computer, so that the people who were like full human, just like flesh and blood, wouldn't be able to survive just because of like you're talking about all the competition?
It's possible. Look, it's possible, and I think Tom Cruise has already starred in a couple of movies about this. But the thing is that this is why, at this point, we actually need to think about the political norms surrounding this. I don't think it's too early to actually think about this problem. Okay, I guess that would be my answer to you. But yes, of course, right? I mean, and we actually live in a world. I mean, there was I think 2 years ago now, there was a report put out by the Brookings Institution called Our Cyborg Future. And what that was about the increasing presence of cyborgs, in our world. Stephen Hawking, right, is a cyborg, Oscar Pistorius, whatever, right? And that people finding these figures more and more attractive and actually would want to become like them, because at the moment, if you think about Pistorius or Hawking, right, they became the way they were because they were, quote, disabled, right? But in the future, people might actually want to become like this, even if they are perfectly fine as humanity 1.0. And so we need to actually think about what would the world be like where people have a kind of selective, mechanism where they could say, well, I want to replace this with get something artificial. How would we live in worlds like this? Yeah, we need to start thinking, and so the Brookings Institution says we actually need to have a kind of legal and political framework that can accommodate people voluntarily becoming cyborgs. This is the point. We have to begin to think about that. Now, yes, sir?
So you mentioned the uploading of consciousness, and I guess that kind of naturally begets then the copying of consciousness. And with that, basically the replication of the individual, what happens to individual value and, the unique inherent value of an individual? Does transhumanism kind of get this utilitarian future whereupon there's no value towards the individual, or is it mutually exclusive with the value of the individual?
It's a good question, because if you look at the politics of transhumanists, most of them tend to be libertarians, which would lead you to think these people put a lot of value on the individual, right? Namely themselves. But in fact, the kinds of futures that the transhumanists envision for themselves could easily, involve multiple selves and collective selves, and where it actually becomes very difficult to demarcate, right, where exactly the value lies. One book I have students read, I don't know if you're familiar with this book, called Mind Clones. It's by Martine Rothblatt. I don't know if any of you familiar with this work. I don't know if this means anything to you. Okay, mind clones. So the idea being that if we're able to, let's say, digitally encode our consciousness, right, and we can have that exist in cyberspace, and it becomes a kind of proxy for us in a sense, and then develops its own experiences as it interacts with others, right? To what extent is it different from us? And and if we want to hold it responsible for something, do we also hold the originator responsible for it? These are very interesting kind of Rothblatt's a lawyer, right? And there's a very interesting legal questions that will be involved there in terms of who's responsible for what and where does the value lie. But I do think, generally speaking, transhumanism does kind of support a kind of proliferation of self, right? In principle, at least.
So then where is the limit of self? Like, is there a bright line where this is no longer you with regards to copying one's own consciousness?
It's an open question. I mean, I think this is an issue that, again, it's an issue that will have to be decided. But people are on both sides on this matter, right? Some people think, it still always goes back to the originator, but others will argue very much on the argument of a child versus a parent, right? That at some point the clone matures, you might say, and it's been sufficiently far away from the origin that the clone has gained enough of its own experiences that could be counted as its own agent. You see, so you've got people thinking about this. It depends what your template, is for legal standing. But we're obviously entering into a new ontological space, right, where the old kind of conceptions don't quite mesh very well. We're going to have to be making it up as we go along. And my point in response to her was, it's not too early to start thinking about this. This is my point. It's not too early to think about this. I mean, we already live in a world, for example, where at least in the UK, if you are married and you're married and both you and your spouse spend a lot of time playing Second Life, right? And it turns out that your spouse is caught cheating. The Second Life avatar is caught cheating with another avatar in Second Life. That can be grounds for divorce, right? Because of the nature of the self and what is regarded as where the meaningful nature of your life is, and the fact that, hey, this is just an avatar. This is not me. I didn't do anything, right? It's just my avatar that was having avatar sex. Still grounds for divorce. It's adultery because of what is defined as the extent of the meaningful life of the person, because these were people who were defined as having spent an enormous percentage of their lives engaged in this activity. This was part of their meaningful, it wasn't just a hobby. This was really what they were on about.
So now if an avatar is an extension of the individual and the man
It depends. Well, see, this is the thing. Again, it depends what your conception of the relation between God and humans are. But if God is existing outside of time and we're existing inside of time, then it may not be, from God's standpoint, a modification, right? Yes, you had your hand up for a while, and we'll get to you. Okay.
My question is basically, I just want to know what a transhumanist defines as human.
Yeah.
Since
So would I.
you talk a lot about standard boundaries and breaking these boundaries, and like, where is the limit? Because like, where is the limit of being human and then just like not? Because I just don't. I understand some boundaries that we want to break in medicine and stuff like that, but there's some point where you just gotta recognize that like you're no longer human.
That's exactly right. That is a real point, and I think for people, so for example, meaning in life. I was recently asked by some guy who was collecting accounts of what counts as living a meaningful life. I was asked what I thought about this issue. And I have to say that it is very difficult to think about the idea of meaning, your life having a meaning, unless you think it has closure, right? And closure typically is connected with mortality, okay? And so when we start to think about people possibly living hundreds of years, right, and maybe indefinitely, as long as you want kind of living, right? So if you want to live forever, you can live forever. If you don't, you don't, right? If it's made that discretionary, then the whole point of having a meaning to life kind of goes out the window, because whatever you've done, you can do something else next week, right? I mean, there isn't that kind of urgency to give priority as to what I need to get done, as it were. And one of the things that's, I think, very interesting in this regard is that when you start, the sort of people who like to talk about living forever don't ever think about having children, right? Because part of the relationship between parents and children has often been about thinking, as it were, you have kind of aspirations, hopes, meanings for lives. You cannot fulfill them all yourselves, so you transfer them in some way, at least you think you do, to the children, right? So they can fulfill them. And this actually helps to stabilize, right, a lot of the relationship between people. But if you think that within yourself you can do everything, if you've given enough time, right? So I'm going to live 500 years, I can do anything, right? I can always regenerate my cells. When I'm 150, I can become a football player, right? Whatever. Then all of that disappears, right? And then the whole idea of actually giving definition, what the point of people's lives are, your own and your children, and the need to have children, all of that can disappear. And so a lot of the normal ways in which we think about the human condition start to disappear. And then there is this question, what's left? I think the transhumanists are really focusing very much on specific dimensions of the human condition. So like intelligence, right? Dimensions that in a sense can be amplified in many different media independently of other things. I think that's typically how transhumanists think. So transhumanism doesn't have a really well worked out notion of the person, right? Because the person is some kind of combination, right, of dimensions in some kind of stable whole, right? Transhumanism doesn't have that, right? For a transhumanist, it's about being stronger, being smarter, right? And all these dimensions can be extended indefinitely. But there isn't the kind of constraint that comes from thinking in terms of a finite person. And I think that is where you can end up losing the humanity, you see, is that lack of a sense of a well-defined person. And that's why I would say that if there is a kind of metaphysical topic, especially from a moral standpoint, that transhumanists need to deal with, is that business of defining the person. Because I don't think that that's really there in the movement. And so you've got a good point. You're raising a very important point. Yes?
So you say that humans have the potential to be involved in transhumanism because of this innate superiority, the Imago Dei, but since Imago Dei is largely based on the idea that we're living with God in our bodies and not just our minds, if transhumanism gets to the point where we no longer have bodies, then haven't we lost the very reason that we strive to achieve something, and doesn't it defeat the purpose of transhumanism if we're no longer human?
Well, I think the issue here has to do with the sense in which we're creating the image and likeness of God. I mean, just to say, the fact that we're creating the image and likeness of God doesn't mean that everything about us is in the image and likeness of God. It just means that what's the most important thing about us is creating the image and likeness of God, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily commit you to being an upright ape.
So is your position that the image and likeness of God, that's purely something that deals with the mind and with our intellect, our personhood?
I think, well, my understanding of it is I think it does involve embodiment, but I don't think it's committed to a specific embodiment, okay? And we can get into interesting discussions about Jesus and why Jesus was, as it were, formed the way he was. But the point is, I think, sometimes in the Wikipedia, I'm described as a Unitarian, okay? And whatever else Unitarianism is, it's kind of on this view, right? Namely, that there is a sense in which we are godlike, but the exact nature, what it is about us that makes us godlike is kind of an open question, you might say. So, but I understand why you would think this would mean that, we're just mental creatures and so forth, and that's often how it's interpreted. But I would say it's better to say that we're potentially multiply embodied. That's the way I would look at it, rather than just saying we're just purely spiritual creatures. Because I do think we are part of the material world. I'm not denying that. Yeah.
I think along with your idea that evolution is a fact, because we've already evolved from looking like
Right.
apes to looking like how we look now.
Yeah.
So to change ourselves by adding mechanics wouldn't really be that much of a
Yeah.
difference. We were really boring. That might be another part of the argument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's right. I mean, I think what evolution gives us is a sense of that we're at a point where we know this, where we didn't know this before. I think it gives you kind of historical marker.
And then also, so you're saying is that we should prepare now because it's going to happen. So it's almost like precautionary and proactive. Because I mean, the thing is, if you have all of your ideas and all of your memories on a device, we know now, obviously, that devices can be hacked and people can
Sure.
they can steal, I guess,
You better believe it, yeah.
your human, like your being. And so you're saying that would come up with
Identity theft already happens. I mean, there's a sense in which, yes, no, I don't. Yeah, and it maybe in the. I mean, this is a good point. But I think we need to be concerned about that. Though, to be honest with you, there may be a discussion in the future about the extent to which we actually want to preserve individual identity indefinitely. Okay. So for example, there is now this whole industry, you may be familiar with it, I have a student writing a PhD on it, the digital afterlife. You familiar with the digital afterlife? Okay, this is a kind of a online thing where forever, you're remembered in some way, right? And so it's not, it could be just photos and text, but it could be much more sophisticated, right? It could be like holograms that are programmed, from things you've said and pictures and so forth, so you can get like kind of 3D versions of you popping out and interacting with the living people, okay? Now some people find that very attractive, but there are other people who in a sense would like to see their memories merged with some larger kind of pool as part of some larger collective intelligence and would feel much more comfortable in an afterlife that's like that, right? So in other words, they wouldn't necessarily want to have to retain their identity indefinitely.
So is that heading towards like the idea of communism, but communism with ideas?
A communism of the afterlife. Well, remember the Borg in Star Trek, right? The Borg, yeah, it's a bit like that. I think those kinds of options will become, discussed, right? Yes, sir. And we'll get to you afterwards. Yeah. Yeah.
So given that this world already has some pretty severe economic stratification, and obviously there's going to be a prohibitive cost barrier to actually transhumanizing oneself, is it ethically right to pursue a future of transhumanism in the form of necessarily have access to these materials and would only further stratify, economic class?
You're absolutely right. It's a big issue. When I first published Humanity 2.0, I was interviewed by The Guardian in London exactly on this point because I actually warned against this, and that's why I thought I said that the National Health Service in our country, because we have nationalized medical insurance in the UK, should actually be on top of this issue now, right? Because there are already attempts, right? People using brain boosting drugs, and they're kind of the low end of transhumanism, you might say, right? To sort of do better on exams and things like this. And the problem is these things are not very well regulated, let alone distributed, right? So people could get all kinds of advantages, right, kind of in a kind of black market way. Not simply because they can afford it, but because it's not even noticed until the results come, until it becomes manifest. So my view about this is actually that the government should be looking into this very seriously, and if you see that certain kinds of treatments and so forth are able to enhance people's performance, then it should be made generally available, right? So there should be a kind of monitoring system, and that's part of an environment where I would allow significantly more self-experimentation with drugs and treatments than currently exists.
And going back to Darwinian selection, if we're giving these people, a companion advantage, could it be argued that transhumanism is almost a eugenics movement?
Well, yes. I mean, I think we need to go back to eugenics, history of eugenics, and actually examine those issues with fresh eyes under the circumstances, because I do think what we would see now, looking at the history of eugenics, if you look at the full history, not just the fact that the Nazis did it, but if you look at the full history, you will see that they were basically engaged in a kind of cruder, because of the state of the knowledge, and also the state of protection on people, which was not so great as it is today, version of what we're talking about now. It is continuous with it. I think anyone who denies that is just, basically turning a blind eye. And it's largely a lot of the same kinds of people supporting it, namely progressive, scientifically oriented people who are supporting that kind of thing. So we do actually need to go back and look at what the original eugenics movement was on about, because it was a very comprehensive movement. I think people have a very stereotyped view of it because of the Nazi experience, but it was really very much about improvement of health, education across the board, and our welfare states are largely based on these ideas, like it or not. Okay, sir, yes.
I'm not even joking. He exactly asked my question.
Okay. I want to get another student in before I get you. Yeah.
So you talked about the idea of the argument between are we equal or superior to animals?
Right.
Are you familiar with Paolo Bacigalupi's short story, The People Stand Aside?
No.
Okay, so one of the main themes in it is that humans are essentially a part of the animal world, and then they've gone through a transhumanistic evolution, and then they've transcended the animal world. So would you argue that we should embrace our animal side, or that we should completely throw it off, or some kind of combination of the two?
Well, look, I mean, I think there are many ways to go on this, right? I mean, I don't want to, I hope people didn't get the impression that I was embracing purely the artificial intelligence approach. I mean, I do think that there's, that's one way to go, of course. But here's something to think about, right? If you really like the fact that we have these animal bodies and that we should be one with the animals and all the rest of it, there is this idea called uplifting. I don't know if some of you might be familiar with the science fiction novelist David Brin. Okay, and he talks in a series of novels he wrote in the 1980s. He talks about uplifting. Uplifting is basically when you take the animals, especially the animals that you're particularly fond of, and you uplift their intelligence so they can become more human-like. Okay? Right? So this is how you respect animals, right? You respect animals and maintain the superiority of humans by humanizing the animals. Okay? And you can think about this in various ways. So for example, improving our capacity to communicate with animals. Now, in principle, that might not necessarily mean changing the animal, it might be changing us, so we can actually perceive what the dolphin's saying, or whatever the dog is saying, whatever. Okay? But that would be one way, from a transhumanist standpoint, of as it were, enabling animals to live in this new world. namely by raising them up to our standards. And people do talk about, is this not a totally crazy idea? So there's this book, Zoopolis, okay? And Zoopolis is by this Canadian political philosopher, usually associated with multiculturalist issues, Kimlicka. The idea here being that if you understand animals, you know, the different environments in which they normally live and so forth, you could actually start to think about them like you would think of, you know, different cultural groups, indigenous peoples, things like that, right? You think of the Canadian context where there's a lot of discussion of these matters. And that you could start to try to come up with ways in which you can actually respect them as equals, and even maybe talk about ways in which you could have a common economy or something with them, you know, where they're being in some way remunerated for benefits that they provide to human beings. I mean, you could actually start getting into that kind of discourse, right? And that would involve a kind of humanizing of the animal world. I don't know if you would buy that, but the point is, I don't think you should think of transhumanism as entirely anti-animal, but would have a different take on animals, right? That animals don't need to be treated merely as animals, but could be involved in some kind of productive relationship with human beings. I mean, I think it's worth putting on the table. Yes?
In some ways, I'm like prospective students might seem to ask more insightful questions than I'm about to ask as a third-year philosophy student. But I'm still confused at the macro or the more macro level why the theological grounding for this transhumanism project is necessary. Because insofar as the transhumanism project is an attempt to push boundaries, to break you know, whatever traditional materialist notions that we have of what humanity is and what existence should look like. I mean, theology, it would appear to me, does have a comprehensive idea of what a finite person is. Mm-hmm. Even if transhumanism doesn't. Theology does have answers in the Abrahamic traditions that would limit, would act as an almost inherent counter to whatever transhumanist intentions appear to be in terms of breaking boundaries. I'm confused as to why that is it to act as a moral counterweight. If so, I still struggle to understand how theology is a moral counterweight to us getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the transhumanist project. Can even accomplish something if the persistent question is still to break the boundaries of what we traditionally know.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of the story, which I didn't really go into very much, but Mark actually alluded to in his introduction, is the way in which our understanding of what the point of pursuing science and technology is tied up to the Imago Dei. In response to the gentleman next to you, I mean, when I was talking about the experimental method, I think all these ideas about the finitude of the person and so forth, I think in a way they serve as kind of regulative ideals for transhumanism to reconstruct the nature of the human. But I think the question you need to ask about transhumanism is, where does it get its kind of overriding sense that we can just push the boundaries indefinitely? Where does that come from? That's especially given that it's had such mixed consequences. And I do think it's a certain kind of fundamental godlike confidence about human beings that began with the scientific revolution. And this is the point, right? The thing about the scientific revolution, starting with Galileo and Newton and people like this, was you actually started to get human beings conceptualizing the entire universe, most of which they do not inhabit in any direct way, most of which is not relevant to their everyday survival. But nevertheless, that then becomes kind of the benchmark, the gold standard by which all knowledge gets produced. And not only does that happen, but that actually seems to have an enormous amount of practical benefits downstream. Right? So in other words, as soon as human beings are thinking that they can actually understand the entire cosmos as a unified system as if they were God, okay, getting into the mind of God is still a trope that gets used to talk about physics today, right? It was at that point that human beings really took off. This is the point, right? The scientific revolution, right, when people started to think in these godlike terms, it actually paid off. It actually paid off. And I think that's part of where, and I think if you didn't have, and if you look at the people who started the scientific revolution, they were God-intoxicated people. They weren't atheists. Okay? Atheists historically have had much more downscaled expectations. Atheists are the people who tell you you're animal. That's what atheists will tell you.
But then is that a pursuit of godlike characteristics in a theological sense or a secular sense?
Well, this is the interesting thing, of course, right? Because starting with the Protestant Reformation, and I realize, I'm saying this in a Catholic university, the Protestant Reformation begins this whole process of Christians taking their religion into their own hands and not trusting authority. Okay? And the first thing that happens is people learn how to read the Bible, they read the Bible for themselves, and among those who are reading the Bible for themselves and drawing their own conclusions were the founders of the scientific revolution, not least Isaac Newton, right? Most of whose writings were all about theological exegesis. Okay? And then that, of course, over time gets secularized, right? And you end up with the deists and the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists and all these other people who leave the church behind entirely. But it's a gradual process that begins as soon as people start to interpret the Bible for themselves as speaking to them directly. And so when they read that humans are created in the image and likeness of God, they see that as directly addressed to them. And they take that seriously, literally even. And I think that's kind of where you start to get on this trajectory. It starts with the Protestant Reformation, and then it moves into the secular era. Yeah, I think that's where, I think it's a pretty clear trajectory, actually. It's just that now, living 500 years later, the religious aspect is no longer so evident. But if you look at how could we have got there? I think there's no other way. It's ultimately this kind of very literal interpretation of our having been created in the image and likeness of God. I think that's what really launched the whole project.
So does that?
We'll get to you.
So what is the contemporary or transhumanism as it is now? Where is that theological drive taking?
Well, this is a good. Well, no. Let me tell you. You're raising a very good question because most transhumanists are in fact atheists. Right? And most of them are libertarians, and they don't have any of this background. That's the other thing. Okay, that's where I'm very different from the other people who call themselves transhumanists. They basically justify transhumanism on the grounds that science and technology enables us to do it. So on libertarian grounds, we should be allowed to do it. I think that's basically the argument. So they don't actually bring in any of this theology. I'm the one bringing in this theology. But I don't think we would have got to where we are now if it weren't for the theology. And that's why I want to bring it back on the table, because I do think the theology, whatever else one wants to say, and I agree with you on this, theology constantly forces us to confront the issue about wherein does our humanity lie. What is it exactly that's human that we would want to preserve through these radical transformations that we're contemplating? Okay? Yes, Mark, you've been very patient.
Well, so you and I, of course, agree on this theological point, right? That the sort of aspirations of the scientific revolution would never really have come about without a theological shift that occurs earlier.
Right.
And I want to kind of put a point on this. It's in relation to a couple of other questions too, particularly the question about the inequality problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that you addressed earlier. If the understanding of what it means to be in the image of God is fundamentally in terms of power, right? That we have the potential to accumulate and expand certain powers, right? I think you would probably agree that our metaphysical understanding of what it is to be human is necessarily related to our moral understanding of what humans should and shouldn't do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is question one, if the foundation of our anthropology is fundamentally in terms of power, in our theological anthropology, then where are the other than just power struggle, right? If that's the view of what it is to be human, right? Isn't it ultimately isn't the whole thing ultimately vulnerable to libertarianism in its most ruthless, sort of outcomes? So that's a question I want to follow up.
Okay, it's true that could be the case. I do think, I think if there, at one level, I guess I will concede that that this issue about redistribution is a power struggle, and that what turns out to be a just power struggle is not something that we actually know a priori, right? So in other words, yes, I accept the reality of power as deciding things in the world, but then I think what becomes very much incumbent is in terms of the ends that we're promoting the power to do. And so there will be, as I've already suggested with the different versions of transhumanism, there are actually different kinds of conceptions of the good human life that are on the horizon that are in competition with each other. And I think that, you might say from a philosophical standpoint, would be where the issue gets adjudicated, but there's no straightforward answer to your question. I think there's a sense in which it's a work in progress what will happen under those circumstances, but it will be a power struggle, there's no doubt about it, okay? There are lots of ways of talking about this. I happen to be someone who believes in maximizing diversity and all of this, but there will be competing values. There's just no doubt about it. That there are multiple ways in which one can actually transhumanize, and so there's no one standard, but it will be done through. I think the question is, where is the power struggle going to happen? Can it happen in a democratic space where the players are accountable? I think that's more the question. That's why I brought the issue about the liberal society, right? Can we have a liberal society where such radically different conceptions of where the human being can go can actually contest fruitfully, right? And where you can get some kind of agreeable outcome, mutually agreeable outcome. Some transhumanists believe in the end we're going to subspeciate. In other words, we're going to go off to our different planets or our different places to live. Some people will continue to live in the humanity 1.0 state. Some will live as uploaded artificial intelligences. Others will live as, Methuselahs, right, forever, and then they'll just be in different spaces. There won't be any kind of common society in which we could all live. I don't like that option, but that's an option that transhumanists do put on the table as a possibility. But you got to follow up.
Yeah, we're at 6 o'clock now, so I don't know if there's officially time for it. I'll throw it out there.
Sure,
for
go ahead.
hang around,
Go ahead. The camera's still on. Yeah.
The other one, this is related to where the last student was trying to get some leverage, I think, which is related to that. I'm not sure that it seems to me that the claim that optimism is fundamentally Christian is premised upon that view of Imago Dei, right? Because what optimism is about is what we can accomplish by the exercise of our power.
Yes.
Right.
It's Pelagian.
Which is distinct from hope, which is hope being connected to humility,
right?
Right, and the kind of Augustinian notion of living within limits and being receptive to good from God,
Yeah.
in not in a less Tower of Babel kind of.
Yeah. No, I agree. Here I might be inclined to finesse things a little bit. So I kind of take the optimism. Again, I don't want to go into theology. Pelagius, who was one of the great opponents of Augustine, right, believed that it was possible through human good works that human beings could actually achieve salvation and improve themselves, right, independently of God. And that is very much part of what the optimism of the 18th century was about. My own view is actually to think about the human being as being godlike in that. In other words, the human and the God are not detached from each other when that's being said. Right, so in other words, I think the reason why this seems heretical is because one imagines that what Pelagius is saying, a human being independent of God in the sense of being a separate being from God. But if we're talking about a human being who's already got God in them, that's already divine in some way, by virtue of being human, then it's not so controversial, it seems to me, if you want. I know you don't buy that. You don't buy that. But that's kind of my take on the thing, namely that, okay, I'm going to go to Alcibiades and then we'll go to you, because you've had a few times, yeah.
My question is pretty concrete, is regarding how is it that transhumanism is to shape the social doctrine of the church. I would say that on one side, for example, in 1996 we have John Paul II talking about evolution as being kind of more than a theory, that kind of the right way. And then we have 2004, Benedict doing something, before he was Benedict, when he was still Cardinal, doing something similar. Then 2014 we have Francis saying that evolution is that's how it happened, right? Which prima facie would probably put the church on the side of evolution. And on the other hand, we can say that when we read the Laudato Si from Francis, you can find there a perhaps precautionary approach to how things are to be taken. On the other hand, we have people like, I don't know, Duns Scotus and Ferrari Chardin, and probably Augustine to some extent.
Yeah,
right?
Don't say that when he's around, but yes.
Right? I mean, where the theologies were adventurous, to say.
Yes.
Right? And there are, when you say that some transhumanists are atheists, I mean, they don't know their history.
Right, that's
right?
true, yes.
They act like confused Protestants, really.
Yeah.
They don't know what's going on. I mean, there's a hugely metaphysical background.
Yes.
You just have to get into a little bit of medieval philosophy and find it there.
Yeah.
The whole university thing for
Yeah.
So, would you say that the Catholic Church position nowadays, for example, Max Moore would say that the Catholic Church should be friendly to transhumanism.
Yeah.
But I think that you say that probably this Pope is kind of a precautionary.
Yeah, I think this Pope is, let's put it this way, he's so smart, he's against transhumanism. No, I think that's the thing. I mean, I think there is a very clear, in a way in which other popes were, and I think he kind of understands this issue, actually.
I see. So you say that probably the position of the church nowadays is precautionary?
Yeah. In fact, yeah, so it's precautionary, yeah, it has all the earmarks of it. I mean, if you in this book, the Proactionary Imperative, one of the things I talk about in the first chapter is how I believe the left-right of the political spectrum is going to turn into up-down. And the Pope Francis is a downwinger, right? In other words, a combination of a kind of traditional conservative plus a kind of communitarian leftist, right? As opposed to, on the other hand, the up-wingers, who would be like the libertarian right and the technocratic left. And those are the proactionary people. Okay? So yes, Pope Francis is a consummate downwinger. I did a TED talk in Iceland back in May last year, and I had to put a little picture, because you need visuals with TED talks, and had Pope Francis as the consummate downwinger, and that there is no comparable politician or public figure to be an upwinger, which would be kind of my side of the issue. But Pope Francis is a very good downwinger. He knows the moves. He knows what he's saying.
Still, the social doctrine of the church will have to somehow accommodate or catch up or experience sort of aggiornamento, delivery of sacraments. They are very concrete issues that will be affected once these pervasive technologies begin to,
Oh, I agree, but I think there's quite a lot of, this is as it were, to make a concession to my opponents. I think there's a lot of mileage to be had by being concerned about poor people and the environment. There's a lot of mileage, political mileage to be had, especially for the church to do it, because really they don't have a lot of defenders. Okay? And so I don't blame Pope Francis for what he's doing, but he's on the wrong side of this argument as far as history is concerned. I didn't mean to be so. I kind of, he's a Jesuit. He's the first Jesuit to become a pope, and I was trained by the Jesuits. Perhaps it shows. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, why an Abrahamic faith as opposed to a less anthropocentric, than theological inquiry? Because I feel like then you have a better or easier way to, justify transhumanism. You're not looking at it per se as a defense of the human, but as a next evolutionary step.
Yeah, but the problem is that the kinds of things that transhumanism is very anthropocentric when it gets right down to it in terms of what it's, so like the business
But
with,
are we interpreting transhumans as being human? Like Homo erectus kind of turns into Homo sapiens, and then there's whatever comes next. Like, is the transhumanist human still human?
well, this is the question that was raised earlier, but I do think, the term transhumanism, I didn't mention it here, but was coined by Julian Huxley, the evolutionary biologist, to characterize the moment at which a species actually understood how evolution worked, and so no longer just obeyed it, but could do something with it. And so that's the significance of the human for Huxley as far as evolution is concerned. And that's why it gets focused on the human. The human is seen as kind of a decision point, or a kind of a locus for a freedom that maybe was never before possible in evolution, right? Because in evolution, natural selection is a blind force, right, with no direction. But as soon as humans understand how evolution works, that species, the human species, can give evolution direction. And this is where the eugenics thing and all the other stuff starts to come out of that. And Huxley was a eugenicist, for example, right? So I do think the human is quite significant, even if we're talking about the thing within a purely evolutionary story, because of the knowledge that humans have, which no other species has.
So one more question before we
Yes,
wrap up
please.
here.
How would transhumanism influence the environment? How would it affect the environment and
It's
the
a good
global
question. No, it's a good question. I mean, I realize we don't have hours. I would just recommend you look this up, eco-modernism. I'm one of these eco-modernists. Eco-modernism is a movement both in Europe and the United States, and what it basically is about, it's about having your cake and eat it, you might say, so in other words, you accept that global warming is happening, you don't deny any of that kind of stuff, so you admit that there are these environmental problems, but you don't think the solution is simply to sort of stop what humans have been doing and somehow downscale, in the kind of way a lot of the green activists talk about, but rather what you're trying to do is to go for a less energy intensive environment, or a more energy efficient environment. So you use less biomass, right? So you don't it's kind of a movement that would tend to move toward nuclear and toward kind of energy sources where you don't have to extract so much from matter, and yet you can get a lot of energy from it. And so you end up leaving the environment relatively neutral. But this is a kind of a long-term plan. I mean, you look at the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, you get a sense. What it would do, it would basically shift the whole energy basis of our society to something much cleaner, but also much higher tech. So it would, what? Yeah. And so that's kind of the view, right? Because I've actually been working because transhumanism doesn't officially have any kind of environmental line. I mean, a lot of transhumanists, in fact, seem to think that if we destroy the environment, we can always fly off to another planet and start all over again. Which I think maybe some people can do that, but I do think that there's something to be said about trying to have a transhumanist solution to the issues on Earth. And so I would suggest you look at the Eco-Modernism Manifesto, which is a very high-tech but kind of clean environment kind of approach. Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
thank
the
you.
attrition. Well,
Thank you.